I'd like to welcome you all to this virtual high-level opening session on the present and future value of WTO membership. It's organized by the WTO Economic Research and Statistics Division in collaboration with the WTO Accessions Division. We're fortunate today to be joined by a highly distinguished panel of speakers with substantial experience relevant to our topic from different viewpoints, including that of WTO as an institution, a recent WTO acceded member, a private sector representative, and an academic. In the interest of time, I will not read out a lengthy introductions, but I invite you to read the panelists' bios, which are available on the WTO website. Although economic theory clearly makes the case for the trade rules and institutional framework of the WTO, the empirical, econometric evidence of the value and impact of WTO membership is often limited or mixed. This is in large part due to the technical estimation difficulty at assessing accurately the WTO's contributions, sorting out the WTO effects from other effects. Over the year, a growing economic literature on the value of the WTO has emerged. ERSD has contributed to this literature in different ways, including quantifying the trade impact of WTO membership, analyzing the WTO's ability to lower trade policy uncertainty, assessing the WTO's ability to prevent trade wars, and measuring the impact of WTO membership on economic growth. Our speakers will provide us with their personal insights regarding the present and future value of WTO membership. We're looking forward to gaining a better understanding of the contribution of the WTO, particularly from the point of view of those wishing to join the organization. Most importantly, we'll explore how the present and future value of WTO membership can provide a platform to support and enhance systemic reform at the WTO with a view to strengthening the multilateral trading system for the benefit of all. Each speaker will deliver a brief opening statement for a duration of 8 to 10 minutes maximum. I will try to enforce that, so please, if you hear me intervene, try to close your comments shortly thereafter. Following the opening statements, each speaker will be invited to ask any of the other speakers a question. Then I will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience, compiled from the Zoom chat. Finally, before closing, each speaker will have an opportunity to share brief concluding thoughts. I would now like to invite Ambassador Alan Wolff, WTO Deputy Director General, to deliver his opening statement. The floor is yours, DDG Wolff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. There's no more important subject for the WTO today than to understand what its value is and what it needs to be in the future. Before the creation of the multilateral trading system, international trade was conducted very substantially in a state of nature. In the early part of the last century, the United States tariff gyrated about from 41% in 1909 to 27% in 1913, back to 38.5% in 1922. And in retaliation, the French government raised its tariff on automobiles, which the US was a major supplier of, from 45% to 100%. Then in 1930, the United States moved its tariff up to just over 59%. Dozens of countries responded with increased tariffs of their own, and these actions deepened and lengthened the Great Depression. During that period, there was no multilateral trading system. National freedom of action was complete. The downside was that a nation's trading partners could and did impose trade restrictions of their own. The attempts to save domestic production through protection proved to be a catastrophic failure. Today, Today, the 164 countries have joined the WTO, including the EU and its member states. Additional 23 countries are seeking to join through the accession process. No country's prosperity is secure outside this system. It's easy enough to assume that this is only true of middle-sized countries or small countries. Not so. You take one of the largest countries and you remove it from the international rule of law, and it could be subject to thousands of attacks on its commerce. Every country with which it traded would become a privateer, potentially, harassing its trade. It might think that it could rely on massive retaliatory power, but that wouldn't be the case. It wouldn't know necessarily what was happening to its trade. There'd be no requirement of transparency. There'd be no requirement of non-discrimination. There would be no notification of proposed standards. There'd be no agreement to apply international standards to its exports of either manufactured goods or food. No prohibition of competing countries using export subsidies would exist on either manufactured goods or agricultural products. So its foreign market shares would be subject to attack. Even the European Union, with 77 bilateral agreements in force, would find that they're not enough. They rest upon the foundation of the multilateral trading system. The immutable rules for large and small countries alike is isolation means decline, integration into the world economy means growth. Since the multilateral trading system was launched, world trade has grown by about 30 times, along with world GDP, which in real terms is more than 20 times what it was in 1950. It's not accidental that the two are related. The value of being a WTO member is wide-ranging. The members' goods are not to be discriminated against at the border or inside a border of a foreign country. Tariffs are not to be imposed above negotiated rates. Regulations governing trade are to be made publicly available. An impressive amount of information necessary for businesses to understand and promote their commercial interests is to be available. Domestic support of agriculture is capped. Disputes are to be settled with the help of independent panels. The list of benefits is very long. The value to a country of belonging to the system does not end with substantive rules. It also consists of procedural rights and justifiable expectations, which include the following: the right to be heard, the right to participate in committees, the right to make proposals, the right to help shape the rules, the right to choose who leads, the right to consultations, and a justifiable expectation to be supported in these endeavors by the WTO Secretariat. A concrete example is a current one of COVID-19 and its response. The division that Bob Koopman heads put out an analysis of the likely effects on trade of the virus and the economic effects of virus. Member countries employed two broad measures, two types of measures: export restrictions and regulations to ease entry of imported medicines, personal protective equipment, and medical equipment. The effort, internal monitoring, is headed by a cross-division, headed by Bob Koopman, and a cross-division task force. And the results are published on the WTO web. Information notes are put out. Webinars are held. And countries are rallying. Groups of countries, members, Singapore, New Zealand, Canada, Korea, Switzerland, among others, announced measures they were collectively taking among themselves in those groups to have a firm level of commitments, and they grow with every announcement to deal with the coronavirus epidemic. In some cases, observers are invited to join. Why wasn't more done? The WTO is a place for sovereigns to negotiate, not a world government. It has no executive branch. It decides fully multilateral matters where all participate in the end result by a committee of the whole. Over the organization's 25-year history, there's been one such agreement, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. The exploration of that agreement as a topic was launched in 1996. It became effective in 2017. That's 19 years. It was a Herculean endeavor. It was worth the effort. It was worth the time spent. COVID-19 came along without warning. There hadn't been a pandemic within the last 100 years. No preparations were made, and the first reactions were national, as you would expect. Nevertheless, groups of WTO members, subsets of the full membership, have now coalesced to consider how best to collectively shape their individual responses. They're now being actively discussed among members, so it points up a chief value of the WTO. It's a place where these sorts of discussions can take place. It's a place where negotiations can take place. It's where there are established common values operating on a set of agreed principles. Now, the future value of WTO membership. No one appreciates the value of WTO membership more than those seeking to join the system, as they must negotiate their entry into the WTO. The path is not easy, although a number of countries' representatives, the chairs, the secretariat are there to assist. Market access and rules-based commitments are made following years of negotiations. These commitments are usually deeper and more comprehensive than those undertaken by original members. The complexity associated with the level of commitments keeps increasing over the years, reflecting the evolving nature of the interests of the participants in the multilateral trading system. This also means that the costs of staying out of the system increase dramatically over time. Evidence prepared by the WTO's Economic Research and Statistics Division shows that the greater commitments of Article 12 members had a significant positive effect on their economic growth. In particular, exceeding members that have made deeper commitments have experienced on average a 15% larger and longer sustained period of economic growth than exceeding members having made fewer commitments. So a key benefit of the process of accession is that it contributes to and helps drive domestic reforms through the adoption of international best practices. Since the establishment of the WTO in 1995, 36 members have joined the WTO, using the accession process as a vehicle to transform their own economies, including centrally planned economies, narrowly based to become more diversified economies, and more fragile to become more stable. WTO accessions are in the vanguard of WTO reform because accession negotiations often stimulate rule-making discussions at multilateral levels. In conclusion, WTO reform is a subject of concern both to current members as well as exceeding governments, due in part to the pandemic, where there have been expectations that have not yet been met. The WTO is receiving heightened scrutiny. Were the WTO members to join together to meet the trade challenges of the coronavirus and the desperately needed economic recovery, public criticism of the WTO would likely be substantially reduced. But the problems experienced by the world trading system preceded the pandemic and will, absent more fundamental reforms, persist after the pandemic is over and the after effects have been addressed. The testing of the WTO is far from over. There will always be challenges. Collective action is essential if global challenges are to be met. Leadership is necessary to carry the system forward and for it to function well. Exceeding governments, which are future members, are not only by their presence reconfirming the value of the multilateral trading system, but they're also a force for change. Through exceeding, they will help lead the way to the future. Exceeding countries' negotiators deserve special recognition. They must not only be intimately familiar with the rights and obligations of becoming a member, but also must understand in detail their own country's economies in every significant area where trade touches it. Participating in accession is a benefit on its own. It is not just the destination, but the journey that is to be prized. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DDG Wolff, for that excellent overview and illuminating all of us on the intrinsic value of the principles of the system. Very, very nice intervention. I would now like to invite Ambassador Aitsanova, permanent representative of Kazakhstan to the WTO, to take the floor and provide us with her insights on the present and future value of WTO membership from the perspective of a recently acceded member and host of the next WTO Ministerial Conference. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Hello? Do you hear?
Yes, we can hear you. Excellent. Thank you.
Distinguished participants of the session, dear Mr. Robert Koopman, dear DDG Alan Wolff, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to welcome you all at this opening session and commend the WTO Economic Research and Statistics Division, as well as the Accession Division for organizing this Accession Week webinars. Let me start my statement by noting that the WTO accession was one of the strategic priorities of foreign economic and trade policy of Kazakhstan in the course of the accession process. And the process was not without challenges and required very high-level political will and engagement, and in particular during the last few years of the very lengthy accession process of my country. Kazakhstan is one of the recently acceded countries. We belong to the so-called Article 12 countries who joined the WTO upon the establishment of the organization in 1995. We acceded the WTO in 2015, and November this year will be marking 5th anniversary of our membership with the WTO. The negotiation process of Kazakhstan since the moment when we have applied for membership lasted for 19 years. And during the 14 years, we completed 31 bilateral goods market access negotiations and 15 services market access negotiations, bilateral ones. And altogether, around 65 countries have participated in our multilateral negotiations on systemic commitments within the framework of the Working Party report, and around half of these members have participated in our agriculture commitments, plurilateral negotiations. So Kazakhstan's accession is referred by some of the members who have actively participated in our accession negotiations as the unprecedented and most complex one due to our membership while being a member of the customs union. So I'll be talking later about how we have worked on this challenging matter. And in the course of the negotiations process, we have introduced changes to 50 national legislative acts in order to bring our national economic and trade policies into compliance with the requirements of the WTO norms. And we also introduced the changes into 10 international agreements, which Kazakhstan was a party within the framework of the customs union with the Eurasian, with the current Eurasian Economic Union members. So I also would like to say that some of the reforms were not easy to undertake vis-à-vis our domestic stakeholders. But as I have mentioned, one should prioritize the accession process, the preparatory process, and make these reforms part of the, incorporate them and make them part of the economic and trade policy of the country. So as an example, I would like to mention that in the course of the accession process between 2006 and 2013, we have incrementally, stage by stage, implemented unification of the railway tariffs. We used to have differentiation in railway tariffs for transportation of goods, the lowest one being the domestic ones between the enterprises within the country, and the second average level being the tariffs which are used for imported goods, in a way the difference serving as an import tax, and the highest being for exporters. So this was not an easy process, as you can imagine, and we have done this stage by stage in close consultation with all the producers and service providers who were involved in this process. We have also undertaken by 2014 unification of excise taxes. We used to have higher excise taxes for imported goods and lower excise taxes for domestically produced goods. We apply excise taxes for petroleum products, for spirit and alcohol and tobacco products. So we had the differentiation. And of course, the excise tax, the higher excise tax for imported products also in a way serving as an additional import duty vis-a-vis these imported products. So this is, again, this process was staged and it has been incorporated into the national policy of, into the national economic and trade policy as part of our market economy reforms. I believe that I need to emphasize here one more time that the preparation for the WTO accession is very crucial, and incorporation of these accession negotiations and the changes which will be introduced into the national policies being part of the national economic and trade policies is highly important in order to speak and to ensure the longer term benefits from the WTO membership. And when it comes to the services market access negotiations, we believed that opening the services market, and particularly under the Mode 3 for commercial presence of service providers, and the negotiations were important for investment policy, because these are the companies which will be investing into your economies. And when you are opening telecommunications sector, when you are opening energy or transportation sectors, or other key sectors, in our case, financial services sector. So you have to make sure that this is very much consistent with your investment policy and with the objectives which you are pursuing in development of these services sectors. And I'm confident that in many acceding countries, a regulatory framework for services sectors is still being developed. And in our case, we were working in parallel on development of the, corresponding to international best practices and standards regulatory framework for services sector, and opening of these sectors as part of our negotiations process. This will make easier your consultations with the domestic stakeholders, with those service providers who are already present in your market. And here I would like to mention that we have first in telecommunications sector, we have abolished exclusive rights of our national telecommunication services provider, Kazakh Telecom Company. And secondly, except for Kazakh Telecom Company, which is one of our strategic telecommunication services provider, we have removed 49% cap for foreign capital investments or foreign capital presence in Kazakhstan's telecommunications market. And now we see these benefits from this type of commitments, from opening of our telecommunication services in increased number of investments, both local and foreign, into the development of telecommunications sector. And when we speak about financial sectors, this was one of the most important negotiations in the services, and I'm sure that this is the case for the recently acceded members, as well as for those ones who are now in the process of accession. So in the financial services sector, we have made commitments that 5 years upon the accession, within the framework of 5 years, upon accession of Kazakhstan to the WTO, we will be allowing direct branching rights for foreign banks and foreign insurance companies. So this year will be, by the end of this year, we'll be opening this market and except for prudential measures, will not be having any whatsoever restrictions for foreign financial services providers in the Kazakhstan's market. Again, this has been very much aligned with our priorities and with our end goals and objectives for development of the financial services sector in my country. So I just would like to give, speaking about the benefits, I just would like to give a few statistics from my country's trade policy, trade performance. So we believe that we see significant increases in FDI, foreign direct investment inflows, as well as trade and export growth upon Kazakhstan's accession to the WTO. In 2019, Kazakhstan's annual total foreign trade volume exceeded $96 billion with a positive trade balance of approximately $20 billion. And this resulted in 55% of growth in comparison with the trade turnover, for example, in 2016. And similarly, our export of goods has been increased 57% comparing with the statistics for 2016. And in the services sector, we see increased investments into the services sector. And we very much relate this 30% increase in foreign direct investments into the services sector with those commitments which we have undertaken as part of our accession to the WTO. And as I have mentioned, I would like to emphasize one more time that this is not just because we have opened the markets, but this is because the opening of the markets was the end result of the domestic reforms which we were undertaking for development of these sectors, as well as we have ensured in the development of the regulatory framework for these sectors of the economy. So we see that in 2000, from the date of accession to the WTO, in the period of 2016 and 19, the total amount of foreign direct investments into Kazakhstan's economy has reached $90.7 billion of around $320 billion in total of foreign investments. And in 2019, only FDI flow was around $24 billion, and 50%, almost 50% of all foreign investments were attracted to non-commodity sectors. And in particular, as I have mentioned, 30% to the services sectors. And this is again, was also a part of Kazakhstan's diversification program of its economic development, because prior to Kazakhstan's accession to the WTO, almost 70% of all our trade was taking place in the mining and oil and gas sector. And around 80% of our export revenues were also originating from the revenues from exports of these commodities. So we believe that a fair and non-discriminatory and rules-based multilateral trading system is crucial for the global economy and development. And I agree 100% with DDG Alan Wolff when he says that he stated in his interventions that the recently acceded members have undertaken far more complex, broader and deeper commitments in comparison with the founding members of the WTO in their accession process. And again, this is very important to make the accession process and any market openings within the framework of the accession process integral part incorporated into the national economic and trade reform policies. So with that, I would like to complete my intervention, and I'll be very happy to participate in the interactive dialogue afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for those very concrete examples of the deep and complex nature of the accessions process and the alignment of national laws with the principles of the WTO, but also the specific commitments in the accessions protocol and the fascinating data of the evolution of Kazakhstan's trade and FDI. I would now like to pass the floor to Ms. Santos, Deputy Director General of Business Europe, to provide her insights on the present and future value of WTO membership from the private sector perspective. I think we heard from Madam Ambassador that many of the rule changes as a result of accessions are probably the kinds of rule changes, legal changes that businesses appreciate very much. Ms. Santos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert, and good morning, everyone. And thanks a lot to the WTO, and especially to you, Robert, for inviting me today to be here and give the private sector perspective. Maybe just to say that, to start, that we really appreciate the fact that the WTO, especially under this current Director General, as Roberto Azevedo, has made significant efforts to build a stronger bridge with the private sector. And I think this is important because, of course, the WTO does not exist if it doesn't have a strong emphasis on the private sector and if it's not supported by the private sector. So I think the evolution that we have seen in the last years is very important. We know, for instance, about the trade dialogues, but not only. So we see increasing appearance of the private sector also during the public forum, and I think this is important now that we are looking for a new Director General. It's important that the process continues when we have a new leadership. Maybe also to explain a little bit what is Business Europe for those who don't know us. So we talk on behalf of 20 million companies around Europe. So it's not only EU, the European Union, but we also have members in countries like Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, of course the UK, and also Serbia, that is a country that is also in the process of accession to the WTO, as it is to the European Union. I would like to talk, maybe to bring the bridge between the past and the future. I would like to talk a little bit about the challenging moment we are crossing right now. I mean, of course, it's challenging for the World Trade Organization. It was already before the COVID-19 crisis. It has become even more important after the crisis. But I think I would touch, starting with the economy as a whole, because of course, we as business are suffering a lot from the current crisis that in our latest estimates as Business Europe could, for instance, impact the European economy with a decrease in the GDP of around 10%. So we are a bit more pessimistic than the European Commission in our calculations. So we need really to build, and this is important, to build a sustainable recovery. And for this to happen, I will give some of our ideas. First, talking about the challenge, because we are still facing them. We see that the economies are opening up around the world with different levels. And of course, we are seeing some that have reopened and now are closing partially. So this is bringing a huge challenge for business. We all know that we live in a globalized world. We have global value chains, and of course, the fact that not all countries closed at the same time and not all are opening at the same time is particularly complicated for companies. I would just give you an example. I think the transport sector is definitely one where we still have a lot of problems, because we know that commercial flights are not yet 100% operating and not operating around the world. And for instance, between the EU and between Europe and US, this is critical because we don't rely only on freight operations. We also depend on commercial flights to make sure that goods move around. So it's still a challenge. Then, of course, and I think the DG Wolff already mentioned, we have seen a number of increase in trade restrictive measures, also some trade liberalization measures, and this is good. But what is concerning us more is the trade restrictive measures, a lot of export restrictions. Some of them have been lifted in the meantime, but others remain. I think I need to praise really the work that the WTO has done and your division as well, Robert, because it was very important to have a good track of what is happening in terms of these restrictions. And we as business are keen to help you also in this work. But above all, it's important that these measures are temporary, and once the crisis is over, which we are going to get to a normal or hopefully normal situation, we need to make sure that they are lifted. We have seen in the 2008-2009 crisis that in spite of the pledges, including at G20 level, a lot of the trade restrictive measures continue. So we hope that this is not a situation that we will be facing now, and I think here the private sector, together with the WTO and also governments, has an important role to play. The other tendency that we are seeing, and it's also important that the WTO monitors it, is we know that governments are pouring a lot of money into the economies. This is good, we need it. We also need, in many cases, that for companies to stay afloat and fight this crisis, they will need money. So also companies are getting access to these funds. We want also to make sure that this support is following existing WTO rules, and this is critical. We know that this state intervention could potentially create market disruptions or increase market disruptions, and we in the private sector, in the business, at least at European level, we think it's important to maintain, to respect the rules, to notify the WTO. This is critical because many countries are not respecting their notifications duties. So it's important to notify the WTO, and that we make sure that these subsidies are not creating further distortions, and that the role of the state in the economy does not become overwhelming in the coming years. The other aspect is digitalization. We have seen it, we are seeing it today. We have this week, the Accession week is all virtual. We are in a virtual meeting. So we also have understood that this is the future. So again, praise and important to commit to the ongoing negotiations on e-commerce in WTO. I think it's very critical. It's also important that we try to increase the scope, because there is clearly one aspect that has come out as very important also during the crisis, is not only the fact that we need to have data flow, is also that we need to have good rules, and we need to have means to address cyber theft and cyber security, and this clearly has been one of the priorities during this crisis, and I think this will stay as in the near future. The other important aspect is that we will need to have a sustainable economic recovery. Again, well, you know very well that in Europe, in the European Union, the economic recovery is going to be axed in 3 pillars, and that's the Green Deal, the digitalization, and the resilience. Of course, I already talked about digitalization, the greening of the economy, and ensuring that we have a sustainable economic recovery, taking into account the need to address climate change, is extremely important for business in Europe and I think around the world. We need to make sure, for instance, that the WTO also reflects this approach. We and Business Europe just released last week a paper on what trade can do for climate. And we have a number of recommendations there, among them a revive on the environmental agreement, goods agreement negotiations, but also we also think that the WTO should embark in a reflection also what trade can do for climate and for the environment. This is also critical to ensure a public support to trade. We are seeing more and more, and you've seen people, especially young people, coming to the streets to demonstrate and in support of climate. And we need also that our trade agenda reflects this reality. So it's definitely another area where we see a role in the future for the WTO. The other one that was already mentioned, I think many of you mentioned it already, is the healthcare sector. where we saw restrictions, but we also saw liberalization. A number of countries took to lifting of VAT or eliminating duties on medicines, on personal protective equipment, on medical devices. We think also here there is an avenue to do more at the WTO. We have the Pharma 040 agreement. It's probably worth rethinking it, maybe expanding it as well, to include these new areas that were important to fight this crisis. So these are all avenues that show the relevance of WTO also for the membership. And maybe to go on a bit more concrete, and this is my ending part, is on concrete what is the WTO bringing for business in the context of the accession. I think the first one is legal certainty. It's very important for business, and most of you already pointed out, this brings new investment, this brings new confidence in the country and the economy. So the fact that you have legal certainty, the fact that countries commit to respect rules, that countries commit to bound tariffs, just bonding tariffs, brings legal certainty. Of course, we know that sometimes there is a huge difference between bound tariffs and applied tariffs. So it would be good that at one point countries revise their tariffs and make sure that the bound tariffs are more in line with the applied tariffs. So this is definitely one important thing. And we hope that some countries that are now saying that they will revise their tariffs upwards, that this is not really happening, because the objective should be to revise it downwards and not upwards. Then, of course, increased market liberalization, both in terms of level and scope. I think this is critical. We know this is not easy. It comes also with a process of reforms in many countries, because it will bring additional competition to the market. It's clear. But in the medium to long term, this is also good for the business in the country, because it gives more choices of products and services. It brings about new technologies. It brings about new investment. In the end, it also brings, the economy becomes more competitive, more resilient, and of course, more open. And I think this is important also for the country that is exceeding the WTO. Then, non-discrimination, transparency, good governance, and respect of rule of law. These are all critical for business. This is what gives confidence in the economy. And I think that it is important as well that governments respect their commitments, starting with notifications. And we know that a lot of problems we've been having lately is because some of the countries, namely on subsidies or even technical barriers to trade, forget to notify the WTO of changes in legislation. Of course, this creates a problem also for the business community. So this is important. Trade facilitation, you mentioned already, critical for small and medium-sized companies and micro companies. The trade facilitation agreement is indeed a big achievement for the WTO. We still need to follow up on the implementation, because we know that we are at different stages of this implementation, but it's definitely an area when it comes to bureaucracy, customs procedures, that impact especially smaller business. So it's definitely one area that is important. And then the capacity building that was already mentioned. Whenever a country accesses to WTO, it also gets support on how to incorporate these changes and new rules in the local legislation, how to do reforms. And one important aspect for us is a stronger participation of the private sector and a stronger dialogue between the private and the public sector. This is not so, sometimes not very strong in some countries. And I think the accession to the WTO can also stimulate the private sector participation in rulemaking and in the closer dialogue with the government. My final point is dispute settlement. Dispute settlement is critical because, of course, we have the WTO as a key body in terms of trading rules. We need to keep trade flowing, but we need to have a level playing field and we need to have the respect of rules. We cannot have Wild West in trade. So that's why it's important that when countries commit to them, they respect them. But this is not always the case. And we need to make sure that we have ways of settling these disputes. And sometimes it's not brought to the attention very often that behind these disputes, of course, they are among governments, but behind these disputes, there are always companies. These disputes impact the private sector. So for us in the private sector, it's important that if governments do respect their commitments, we have ways of enforcing and protecting our interests as business. And that's why we are extremely concerned about what is happening to the appellate body, because this is critical also to ensure that we maintain an objective and transparent process that really ensures the best decision in the end. And we have right now a case that everyone is talking about, and that's the Airbus Boeing case, where we are expecting, for instance, an important ruling from the WTO side when it comes to the award that is given to Airbus. We have already that award for Boeing. It will be important also that we ensure timely decisions. Right now, we have a situation where we think that the longer it takes to the WTO to decide on this, the worse it will get for the business community, but also it will be difficult to get a deal that we think is the best option for this long-term dispute. So a lot of positive things on the WTO side. We think that there is definitely an interest, and that's why so many countries are still in the process of accession. We also think that the WTO should and will remain a cornerstone of world trade, and that we think that the WTO has a very important role to play as a key pillar in the economic recovery post-COVID-19, both for developed and developing economies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Santos. For particularly pointing out how important the principles that underpin the WTO agreements is. And I'd point out that when we start talking about climate change, digitization, things like that, that there's a lot of flexibility within those core principles, and it's up to member governments to decide how to take forward new initiatives in those areas, recognizing that there is this flexibility. I would now, I think we're running a little bit behind, so I'd now like to turn to Professor Monika Mrazova from the University of Geneva to provide her insights on how economists have evaluated the contribution of the WTO. Monika, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much to the entire research division, and in particular to Robert Koopman for inviting me to join this, this opening session. So the WTO and its predecessor, the GATT, have been a fascinating subject of study for economists for quite a long time now. This study has involved lots of, I would say, quite heated discussions. So economists didn't always or don't always agree on the conclusions. So in talking about how economists value the contribution of the WTO and its predecessor GATT, I would like to mention some of these debates and to come to the conclusion that the economists have reached. So the first, I would say the initial debate was whether the WTO and the GATT had any impact. Okay, from the, if economists estimate how the WTO impacted the evolution of both the trade barriers, trade and growth since the Second World War. There has been actually, the answer to this question was not obvious, and there has been actually a discussion on whether the GATT and WTO did play any role. So in the early years 2000, there have been a series of papers in the literature published in very good journals who argued that basically the GATT-WTO did not have any impact, and that this trade liberalization, which happened since the Second World War, would have happened anyway, whether or not the WTO and the GATT was there. Where these conclusions were challenged, and it has been proved that there were some caveats in the analysis, and there has been an enormous emergence of research papers actually showing that the WTO GATT had a tremendous impact. So it's usually cited now in the introduction of all papers dealing with the WTO and the GATT that the average ad valorem tariffs were reduced from over 40% to less than 40% to 4% in since the Second World War. Since the Second World War, the merchandise export grew on average by 6% annually. And just to give you one comparison of two numbers, in 2000, the world trade was 22 times the level of what it was in 1950. So an enormous increase in world trade, and economists now agree that the GATT WTO was crucial in bringing about this prosperous trading system, contributing to an unprecedented growth. More recently, where economists think the GATT WTO made a huge step forward, and what was a huge success was what was already mentioned in this discussion, the trade facilitation agreement. Okay, so there is again an important literature showing that uncertainty is very bad for trade, and the trade facilitation agreement, by reducing the level of bureaucracy and by reducing uncertainty, is very important for developing trading relations and increasing trade. Now, the second kind of big debate in the literature was more on what were the keys of the success of the GATT and WTO, or how does this organization work, and what are the features of the GATT WTO that helped these successful negotiations that then reduced trade barriers and led to an increased trade. So again, there was a big debate in the literature. In 1997, famously, the Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman stated that, just to give you a quote from his work, the economic theory underlying trade negotiation is nonsense. The implicit mercantilist theory that underlies trade negotiation does not make any sense on any level, but it nonetheless governs actual policy. Okay? So since then, again, there has been enormous progress in the literature. We now have several theories explaining how the GATT and later the WTO negotiations work. What's been key is to find an understanding for the underlying rules of these negotiations. Okay, so mainly two rules have been put forward as the foundational principles, as they are sometimes called. It's the rule of reciprocity and the rule of non-discrimination. So countries meet in the WTO/GATT, which is a negotiation forum for the countries, and they exchange mutually beneficial concessions, and then they extend these concessions on a non-discriminatory basis. And this makes the success of these negotiations. Again, so these negotiations were very successful in bringing down trade barriers, and initially they started as negotiations mainly on trade barriers on goods. The WTO has got naturally more ambitious over time. So in addition to trade in goods, services were included, then agreements on intellectual property rights and some environmental clauses, labor standards, etc. More and more gets incorporated. So this brings me to the second part of the question that I was asked. This is something that's now being studied in the literature, but more work needs to be done to understand how the WTO and GATT can bring on the table non-trade issues in addition to trade issues. And so in certain dimensions, the WTO was very successful. as was already mentioned, on the uncertainty dimension, for example, with the trade facilitation agreement. In other dimensions, the progress may seem a little bit slow. So again, more work is needed to understand this. Another area that's been not yet very much explored by economists, but that I personally believe merits a lot of attention, is the role of the WTO, not only as a negotiation forum, but just simply as a discussion forum. Okay, so it's a place for countries to meet and talk things through. And so there has been a little research done within the research division of the WTO showing that this discussion platform is potentially very important and may actually help resolve issues that countries may have between themselves. But I think much more work on the academic side is needed to explore this point. Luisa Santos mentioned how important the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO is, and I couldn't agree more. Economists also value this side of the WTO very much. Now, with this dispute settlement mechanism being under attack, I think the discussion platform of the WTO is getting more important, because maybe quite a few issues between countries can be resolved by simple discussions before going into the dispute settlement procedure. So I think that's an area where much more research is needed. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Monika. Very, very useful summary of the literature. Thanks for not going into identification issues around estimating the different effects. It's something we economists love to discuss, but I don't think anybody else likes to hear. So we've had very thoughtful opening statements from our speakers. And now I'd like to invite them to consider asking fellow panelists other questions. DDG Wolff, do you have any questions that you would like to address to your fellow panelists?
Yeah, very briefly, all excellent presentations from my fellow panelists. I really appreciate them. For Ambassador Aitsanova, what advice would you give to acceding countries? You know, they're very diverse now, but many of them are conflict affected and have many challenges. What was the most difficult challenge that you faced? I'd say for Ms. Santos, what would the form of engagement be best for the WTO with the private sector to enhance it? Because obviously members are going to make the decisions on what is negotiated. So there's engagement presumably at the national level with respect to our members. How can it be better managed in Geneva? And I suppose for Monika Mrazova, just there are divisions in the economics profession about the value of trade. Some are very wary of it. What is the predominant view? If you could point to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alan. I think I'd like to have responses to these questions, and then we'll go to the next question where I'll ask Ambassador Aitsanova to ask questions. So, but first let's have responses to Alan's questions. Your Excellency. Ambassador Aitsanova, would you like to respond to Alan's question? Thank you.
Yeah, do you hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I already made my key advice, which is to undertake the process of accession as the creative one and incorporate it into the national economic and trade policies, and do all the changes in close consultation with key stakeholders, both from private sector and the government, and foreign investors, and you know, and all the changes which we will be making should be done in as a result of the very participatory consultative process. This is very important in order to make sure that the benefits will be long-term. And this will be not something imposed on acceding countries as a result of some commitments which have been undertaken because of the pressure from other members in the course of the accession process, but because of the well-thought and comprehensive reform agenda of the acceding country. And I understand that acceding countries are diverse, but I believe that the challenges are the same for acceding countries. It's on the side of capacity building, to have sufficient capacity to interact with key negotiators who are very experienced and who have seen many accessions, and who are also experienced in conducting the multilateral negotiations within the WTO. And second, my advice would be also, you know, when you make these accession commitments, be it on services, be it on goods side, or systemic trade policy measures, I believe that this is very important for you to own the process. And from our experience, the accession process and the reforms which are undertaken as part of the preparatory work for WTO accession is more important than the accession process itself, because accession, it's just a final end. And what is most important is what changes you'll be making, and to make them sustainable and to make them well thought, rather than because of having this accession process, because of the necessity of accession. So I believe these are my key advices. And the third would be on the institutional side. In our accession process, we had an intergovernmental body, which was consisting of deputy ministers of key ministries, and we also included private sector representatives into that body. So whenever we were making an offer on any issues, we have had discussions within this consultative mechanism, within this consultative body. So these are very important points. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Ms. Santos, so how might the WTO improve its engagement with the private sector?
Thank you. Well, it's a very good question. Of course, we know that we have the annual WTO forum. I think that's not just with the private sector, is open to a number of stakeholders, but it's also important because I think that more and more also in our own at regional level, at national level, we have also these platforms that involve not just business, but also other stakeholders. So I think it's important to keep that platform. With business, the trade dialogues, I think we should try them in a more consistent way, having maybe some clear agenda with clear topics to follow up, and using as platform. And we know that we have been doing this. We have created groups that have a say in different aspects. But maybe we should focus on one or two of the negotiations that are ongoing at WTO level, and try to build under these one or two negotiations. I'm thinking, for instance, about e-commerce. Build or try to build consistent discussions with business, not only virtual, because we've been exchanging a lot via emails, but maybe do more on a meeting that now is also virtual, but do more on meetings and try this way to make progress. To create, because I know there's been discussions about creating a specific organization called Business at WTO, like there is one at Business at OECD. It might be in the future an option. I think the risk we have is, of course, that we create such an organization that is so big with so diverse interests that it will not be easy to get consensus. So I think we should build on non-formal platforms first and develop them a bit further before transforming it into a formal organization. That's my view. Of course, I mean there are other views, but that's my view, that we should not go immediately to a formal organization. We should try to develop a bit further the work streams that we have now, especially the trade dialogues. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Professor Mrazova, do you have a reaction to where the profession is on the predominant effects of trade liberalization in the WTO?
Okay, so I would say there is a general agreement on the fact that trade is good among economists. Now, not necessarily good for everyone. That's the important qualification. Overall, or on average, trade leads to a more efficient allocation of resources, so it increases consumption possibilities, and it makes, to use an image, the size of the pie bigger. But then how we divide the pie among different interest groups, that's a different question. And I think so there was a bit of a backlash against economists and recently and against globalization. I think one mistake that economists and particularly trade economists have made in the past, 20 years is that we've been always putting forward the fact that trade is good, but the qualification that it may not be always good for everyone, that's kind of being swept under the carpet, because we know that theoretically, because trade is good for on average, the losers could be compensated from the winners. But this compensation isn't always easy in practice and is not always implemented. So because we didn't really talk about it and didn't address this, it looked like trade economists only thought that trade was good and that full stop, and that's it. Usually what's in terms of how economists view trade, what's being put forward is that trade, so it has different distributional consequences on different interest groups. So there might be losers and there might be winners from globalization. Very similar to this is, for example, technological progress. Technological progress has winners and losers. Nobody, the majority of people would never argue against technological progress. So the argument for the consequence for trade is, well, we shouldn't argue against trade, we shouldn't resort to protectionist measures, but we should put our effort into thinking how to ensure that those who don't gain from globalization don't lose out. And that's also, I think, an important topic for future research, and probably much more collaboration between the WTO and academics, is what could the WTO do in future agreements to ensure that those who wouldn't benefit from globalization are not left behind.
Thank you, Monika. Ambassador Aitsanova, do you have questions you'd like to ask any of the other panelists? You can just ask a panelist, you can ask all the panelists, or you can say, no, thank you. I think I know what I need to know now. Your Excellency, yes, okay.
Sorry. I would like to ask one question, which would be the same for any of the panelists who would like to respond to that question, to reply to this question. So I talked in my intervention a lot based on Kazakhstan's experience about the accession process. But I looked at the list of participants, and these are mostly the representatives of the acceding countries. So I'm confident that for them it would be very interesting also to know what's going on in the WTO now, among the members of the WTO. And these days we talk a lot about the challenges for any core functions of the WTO, being it dispute settlement or negotiations function. And I would like to ask about the negotiation function. We speak that multilateralism is in crisis. It's very difficult to reach an agreement based on our 5-year membership within the WTO. We see and we are facing that there are enormous challenges facing multilateralism, and it's very difficult to reach an agreement and consensus among 164 or 65 members of the WTO. And if the acceding members are different, but I think that the members who are participating in the WTO are very diverse and are at the very different stages of their economic development. We have a group of LDCs, we have a group of developing countries, and we have developed countries, so members. And my question is, what do you think about the role of plurilateral agreements? Because we see some of the key negotiations currently taking place among like-minded countries, so-called like-minded countries. And do you believe that the future of the WTO will be with plurilateral agreements, or should we still insist on multilateralism? So that's my question. Anybody who wants to intervene, please feel free. Thank you.
Alan, please.
An initial reaction. I think that the WTO has been in working to move forward with coalitions that are like-minded for some time now. The pharmaceutical agreement, which began some 15 or 20 years ago and was last updated, I think, around 2010 or so, does not have all members in it. Those who joined felt it was in their interest, and they did it, and they eliminated tariffs on pharmaceuticals. The list has not been updated lately, and it should be. The information technology agreement is another example, which is its most favored nation, but it's also those who are like-minded, which happen to cover over 90% of world trade in the goods that they covered, have proceeded on that basis. The initiatives, the joint initiatives that came out of the Buenos Aires 2017 ministerial are those who are like-minded, and they haven't decided at this point how to integrate their results, because they don't have the results into the WTO. So that is not answered yet. And countries are moving forward on their own. Singapore and New Zealand decided that they could, between the two of them, handle the coronavirus in terms of impact on trade in a forward-leaning manner. And others joined in the general statement. Canada has put on the table an initiative with respect to agricultural products, which is very promising. 49 members of the WTO signed up initially. I don't know, the number may be more by now. But so is it plurilateral? It's those who are like-minded moving forward, and those who wish to join can move forward with them. That can't happen as readily for things like subsidies, domestic subsidies, industrial subsidies, agricultural subsidies, fish that don't lend themselves to just a few countries deciding that they can move forward alone. There needs to be others brought along. So I think there'll be variable geometries, but there is progress being made. It's being made by members who want to see progress being made. And all of these are open to the acceding countries. And So it's a bit of some fresh air being brought into the process of negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Santos, do you have a question you'd like to ask one of your other panelists?
Yeah, well, maybe just to come back, only one comment on the plurilaterals. Of course, from the business perspective, one of the main challenges of the WTO is how long it takes to do agreements and how long it takes to revise the rules. And of course, the trade and the business moves very, very fast. So the plurilaterals for us are important because they are an attempt to try to be a bit faster and try to adjust also the rules to the reality of the business side. So I think they are extremely important and they should continue also as a way to convince country of the benefits. Sometimes you need to start the process and others will see that these are beneficial. Maybe I'll put my question in general to my co-panelists. What in your view is the main challenge of the WTO right now? And there are many.
Thank you. That is an excellent question. Do I have any takers?
Just very generally, we have to find a way to move forward. We can't allow the pandemic to interfere with communication among the members and between the members of the Secretariat, and that is on its way. Meetings are now being held, sometimes hybrid, and sometimes, but all can attend with some restrictions on for health reasons in terms of social distancing, that sort of thing. So there's that. The Secretariat has become very active. The notes, the information notes that have been coming forward, the estimates that have been coming forward, a lot of this has been stimulated under Bob Koopman's direction, but there's a spirit of wanting to be as supportive as possible, and the members are rallying. And we cannot allow selection of a new Director General to interfere with the process of moving forward, but we will have, within a matter of months, a new leadership with perhaps a change in direction or different set of visions. And I think going into 2021, having maintained momentum, there will be a time of significant positive forward movement.
Thank you, Alan. I'll weigh in briefly on this. If you've read Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*, you know that he argues that many of the business and governmental and societal constructs that we have are myths that you have to believe in. And I would argue that the WTO needs its members to believe in it. So there's a deep philosophical question there. Will members actually believe in the WTO? And then I think there's a practical set of expectations. I think early on in the COVID crisis, there was lots of concerns about WTO members taking policy actions and not being, transparent, targeted, and temporary. And I think as we've watched over the last couple of months, we've seen that they have indeed been transparent. We'll have to see if they're going to be as targeted as they say, and we'll have to see how temporary they are. But the transparency part has started to come through. And it turns out it's complex. Notifications or letting other members know what's happening in your governmental policy when you sit in the trade directorate and over in the health directorate, they're taking steps on an emergency basis and not necessarily communicating very closely. And then how do you bring that to the WTO and other members? I think there's a very, very practical set of complexities, and and managing those expectations among members and among the private sector is pretty important. Okay, I'm sorry, I went on too long. Professor Mrazova, do you have a question? You have two policymakers, a business person sitting here. What would an academic like to hear from her fellow panelists?
Okay, can I just take 1 minute to get back to the two previous questions? So the question of plurilateralism. Obviously the membership of the WTO is expanding, and with more members it gets difficult to reach an agreement and to find also policy measures that are 100% positive for everyone. So agreements like the Information Technology Agreement, which has been mentioned before, are very interesting also from the academic perspective, because these agreements, so they don't require the participation of everyone. The participation is voluntary, and the agreement becomes enacted subject to a minimum participation constraint being reached. So this looks like a very promising feature, actually, where countries for whom it would be beneficial, who know that it would be beneficial, can join this agreement. Those who think that this wouldn't be beneficial don't have to join, and then with time, the agreement may become interesting for more and more countries, so more and more countries could join. So this is actually a feature that looks very promising. On the challenges to the WTO, I think I already mentioned one that I think is very important is going forward, trying to think very hard how to mitigate the negative effects of globalization and to make sure that there are no participants that get left behind. I think that's very important. And then coming to the question that I would have, so to all actually it's a question for all the panelists from a different perspective, is how do you see the role of non-governmental agents in trade negotiations? So I've already mentioned, and this has been mentioned several times, the WTO is a forum where countries come to negotiate. Now, what's the role of non-governmental organizations? It can be firms or consumer representatives, etc. Going forward, is there more room being made for these agents? For Ms. Santos, do you feel it's important to be involved in these negotiations, and how can it change the future of these negotiations?
Thank you, Professor Mrazova. Let me first ask, and by the way, we have some questions in the Q&A that I'd like to get to. And we're running out of time. Hopefully we can take a few extra minutes because we started late. But Ambassador Aitsanova, do you have a reaction to Professor Mrazova's question?
Am I correct that the question was about the future of negotiations?
The question was about the role of non-governmental organizations, other stakeholders in WTO negotiations. And you mentioned that you have engagement as, so please.
I believe that in any negotiations, we are talking today about accessions, and particularly in accession negotiations, as well as in ongoing negotiations within the WTO, it's very important to have business involved in the negotiations process. This is important to make sure that the government's position fully reflects the interests of the business, both domestic and foreign businesses who are present in the economy of the country. And so that was our experience, and we have worked out every position jointly with business stakeholders. And I believe that it's also important to involve research institutes and think tanks, because sometimes they can give you some tips in the negotiations process and give their own analytical work, which could give different perspective and different insights to the process. So I believe that the broader is a process, more participatory, the better the outcome would be. And I believe in the sustainability of the solutions when the decisions are made as a result of the consultative process with the domestic stakeholders, key stakeholders. So this is my answer. I'm sorry, I was just reading these questions which came from the audience and missed the question of Professor Mrazova. Thank you. And there were some questions from the audience addressed to me.
Yes.
When I give a floor, I'm ready to respond to them too. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Let's get a quick reaction from Ms. Santos in terms of NGO. By the way, I think Monika is also thinking about labor groups, consumer groups, things like that. As she mentioned, you know, there are winners and losers. You know, we tend to think there are winners and losers within firms, but there may be winners and losers among workers, households, things like that. So, Luisa, please.
Thank you, Robert. I think I mentioned already that we find it important to have a strong stakeholder participation in the WTO and in the negotiation process, because this is how the organization and the process is also legitimate. Because otherwise, of course, if you're not engaging publicly, it means that your work is seen as untransparent, seen as sometimes disconnected from the reality. So that's why in my initial remarks, I also praise the fact that the SDG has reached out to business. I think also through the public forum, it has reached out to other stakeholders, not only business, academia, trade unions, environmental NGOs, and I think this is important to continue. I mean, in Europe, we have a very transparent trade policy, as you might know, where we even have a dedicated group that was created where we discuss the ongoing trade negotiations that the EU has with third countries, and it contains basically the business, the trade unions, NGOs. So it's something we are experienced, and we think it's important also to make sure that there's stronger support for trade because we have huge problems, especially in developed economies, from the public side, the public opinion, and I think this is important to bring them to the table to make sure that they understand also what actually is at stake.
Thank you. Alan, do you want to weigh in?
Just a 60-second intervention. In agriculture, on the environment, on cotton development assistance, we have had workshops, we've brought in the private sector, we've brought in others who have something to contribute, and I think we have to do more of that. The point that was made by Professor Mrazova with respect to those who are left behind, the ILO and labor interests will have a particular point of view that should be listened to. Members are increasingly interested in environmental issues. Had MC12 taken place this month, there were going to be a lot of side events. We can't lose those side events because they inform both members and the Secretariat of current concerns of groups that are not either in the WTO as members or as Secretariat. And consumers shape trade. So we should hear more about where their interests are and where they're headed.
Thank you, Alan. Ambassador Aitsanova, do you want to take on some of the questions you've seen come through in the chat? I think we can take a few extra minutes.
Yes, hello. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I had 3 questions which were addressed. I read them among the questions which came from the audience, from participants. The first question was about the reduction in bound levels of import duties, which we undertook as part of our commitments, and the correlation with domestic prices. You know, as we have noted from our own experience, there is not necessarily the direct correlation between the reduction of import duty levels applied vis-a-vis imported products and the prices domestically. I believe that this is due to a combination of factors, of macroeconomic factors, as well as factors which come from the real sector-based factors. So first, it's we know that the prices for imported products in domestic currencies also very much depend on the exchange rates. And if the exchange rate fluctuates, and normally it fluctuates that the foreign currency becomes more expensive, then this is also reflected in the prices of imported products. Then we also know that there are a number of change in the supply chain, which could also add up in the prices. So our experience is that also we wish that there was a direct correlation between the import duty rates and the domestic prices for the similar products for which we are lowering our import duties. It's not the case in for certain groups of products. So that's my answer. And second was about, I mentioned in my intervention earlier that our accession process was in a way unprecedented and challenging one. It was due to the fact that we were members of the customs union with Russia and Belarus when we were acceding to the WTO. So we had to correlate our common external tariff applied by customs union members with those commitments which we have undertaken as a result of our independent, standalone bilateral negotiations with the involved parties in our accession process. So as a result, for around 3,500 product lines, we have lower duties than common external tariff, and we have made an unprecedented agreement with members in order to allow for Kazakhstan to accede to the WTO, and while being a member of the customs union, that Kazakhstan, for its own territory, will be applying exemptions from the common external tariff of the customs union at a lower rate for 3,500 products, and then upon expiration of the transitional period, we'll be having, along with the customs Eurasian Economic Union members, an adjustment tariff negotiation. So, and there was a question whether the membership with the Eurasian Economic Union should precede the WTO membership. It should be the choice of the national government, of each national government, and they will decide, depending on their priorities, which process is more important, or which process could happen earlier than the other one. So therefore, our experience was unique, but it was Kazakhstan's experience, and of course one can learn from it. And another question, which was for Kazakhstan, was about MC12. You know that due to COVID, yes, it's true that due to the situation with the pandemic of COVID-19, it has been decided by the General Council members, based on the request of Kazakhstan, that will postpone the ministerial conference to next summer. So at this stage, there is no yet decision, but we have submitted our letter indicating that we'll be ready to host, provided that the situation is stabilized with pandemics, that we'll be ready to host the next ministerial meeting next summer. Now we are expecting the decision of the General Council of WTO. And normally it's the General Council and members who make decisions about the venue and dates of the ministerial conferences. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We have two questions related to, well, two questions from a participant from Africa. One of the questions is, how might the views of Africa on the future of the WTO be captured in this high-level opening. We don't have participants from Africa, but I don't know if DDG Wolff wants to take a shot at that. And the same participant asks how far the WTO has gone in resolving the dispute settlement stalemate. Again, perhaps DDG Wolff would like to try to answer that question.
Thank you. On Africa, in terms of accessions, many of the acceding countries, those who are seeking to come in, are in Africa. Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and there are very active processes going on. Africa is well represented in those who seek to be Director General. There are two currently from Africa, one from Nigeria, one from Egypt. The WTO has, officials have said, will do everything they can to help the African Continental Free Trade Agreement become a positive reality, to the extent that any advice or help, technical assistance would be welcome. Africa is lagged in terms of participation in the world trading system. That share has dropped over time. In terms of internal trade in the continent, it's lower than other regions of the world. So anything that can be done, should be done with respect to helping Africa. And that's a major, we've had separate webinars addressing Africa. This one didn't happen to, so it's not an intentional omission. On the dispute settlement, what is happening is that some members have decided on an interim arrangement and are putting that into effect. They've chosen their arbitrators for an appellate function. And there will be a dialogue over time, I'm sure, to try to restore a legitimate, in the eyes of all, a single appellate function. But is there a lot of progress on that front right now? No, not that I have seen. But I thank you for those questions.
Thank you, DDG Wolff. We are well beyond our 1.5 hour time that we set for this. There are still some good questions. I think what I'll do is I'll share these questions with the panelists and let them try to respond in writing at some later point, should they have views that they'd like to share. I'd also like to make the unilateral decision that we were planning on concluding remarks, but since we've had good exchange, good questions, Q&A between the panelists and from the audience, and we've run out of time, I think I'll unilaterally decide that we will pass on concluding statements. I would like to thank all the panelists for joining us. I'd also like to thank all the participants. We've had a good turnout here, about 115. I saw a peak of about 126 participants joining us for this very informative session. So we can't give applause to the panelists, but we can give a nod and our thanks. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.